All right, you may know him best as the former vice presidential candidate for the Green Party, but Ajamu Baraka has a long career spanning several decades dedicated to fighting segregation, the war on drugs, interventionist U.S. foreign policy, and a host of other problems plaguing the U.S. and beyond. He served on the board of several human rights organizations, including the Center for Constitutional Rights. The In Question team is very honored to host Mr. Baraka starting right now. All right, Mr. Baraka, we've got a lot to talk about, but I wanted to first get your reaction to breaking news which just came down this morning. Authorities have arrested a suspect in the mail bombing case, which has rocked the country this week after several prominent Democrats and intelligence officials were sent explosives via the post office. The suspect is reportedly a 56-year-old male registered Republican named Cesar Sayoc. Let's listen to what Trump said of the arrest just a few minutes ago.
I am pleased to inform you that law enforcement has apprehended the suspect and taken him into custody. It's an incredible job by law enforcement. We've carried out a far-reaching federal, state, and local investigation to find the person or persons responsible for these events. We will prosecute them, him, her, whoever it may be, to the fullest extent of the law.
The suspect also happens to have quite the arrest record, including a history of calling in other bomb threats. What is your reaction to this news so far?
Well, I think it's reflective of a very dangerous environment in the U.S. It's, of course, a relief that a suspect was, in fact, arrested. But it still speaks to the fact that there is a very toxic environment in this country, one in which not only incivility, but violence seems to be on the table now as legitimate ways in which we deal with political differences. So this environment in which we see an intensification of aggressive messages, and the call for aggressive actions is creating an environment in which it is not surprising that we had this kind of reaction from someone who is in their own minds believing that they are engaging in a political act.
I don't want to spend too much time on this issue as we don't have all the details necessary yet, and I'm sure the corporate media will be covering it nonstop. So let's move on to something else. I want to ask you about the event which brought you to New York, the People's Tribunal on U.S. Crimes against Puerto Rico, which is scheduled for tomorrow. We know right now that it's very unlikely international courts will take up this issue anytime soon. So why do you think it's still important to hold these symbolic tribunals?
Well, we need accountability, and as you said in your comment, your question, we don't believe that there's going to be any real attention on this issue anytime soon from, of course, U.S. authorities and even from international bodies. So we are hoping to keep the attention on this ongoing tragedy in that country, in that colony, by having this tribunal where we are going to document the ongoing human rights violations taking place on that landmass. That's important for accountability. It's important for the historic record. It's important for organizing and educational purposes. It's important for us who believe in democracy and who believe in the ultimate objective, which has to be for the people of Puerto Rico to be repaired and for them to be given some degree of political independence. One of the issues that they face is the fact that they have no self-determination. Mm-hmm. They're dependent on the U.S. state, and we see the consequence when the U.S. state fails to respond to their needs.
Which is why it's often characterized as a really colonial relationship, and Puerto Rico is perhaps the most clear example of a modern-day colonial relationship with the United States. But the U.S. African Command is also often characterized as a tool of colonialism. Timed with AFRICOM's 10th birthday earlier this month, the Black Alliance for Peace launched a campaign calling for it to be shut down. Why is Africa the next frontier for the U.S. military?
The scramble for Africa is a central part of the struggles taking place for world hegemony, basically. We know that in the latter part of the 19th century, it was the scramble for Africa that determined what empires would emerge as dominant. And we see that today in the 21st century, a new scramble is taking place. The U.S. has decided that it's going to respond to this scramble by using its most effective tool, it believes, which is the military one, in response to their main competitor, as they see on the African continent, being the Chinese. So as the Chinese are engaged in providing assistance for infrastructural development, roads, ports, railways, for example, the U.S. is responding by providing increased military assistance. We say in the Black Alliance for Peace that assistance, that so-called assistance, has been detrimental to Africa. That basically, as we've seen the footprint of the U.S. military expand on the African continent, we've seen also the expansion of destabilization and violence on the continent. So we want to see the U.S. to withdraw from the African continent. We want to see the U.S.-Africa Command to be shut down. Those resources are brought back to the U.S. To be reallocated to address the needs of people in this country, and for Africa to be a zone of peace as opposed to a zone of militarism.
The issue you touched on, the way China's opted to engage with the continent through economic development, even going as far to forgive loans of impoverished and indebted nations. Still, the corporate press has characterized this sometimes as a new form of colonialism. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I mean, we don't want to trivialize the reality of European colonialism on the African continent. Colonialism on the African continent is responsible for the underdevelopment of the African continent and the underdevelopment of the African people. It was a brutal experience that resulted in death and destruction. So the kind of activity we see the Chinese engage in today can in no way be compared to that very dark period in African experiences. So no, we reject that. We know that the Chinese were not naive. We know the Chinese have their own particular national interests. But as long as they are proceeding in the way that they are, and in helping to engage in economic development, we say that there's a fundamental difference between the two kinds of colonial experiences.
Perhaps it's aimed at finding mutual interests between nations that China has kind of embarked on there. But on the theme of expanding U.S. military reach, this week Trump announced the U.S. will withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was established with the Soviet Union in 1987. In response, Russian President Vladimir Putin said this week that any country which opts to host new U.S. nukes is potentially inviting Russian retaliation. What's behind this push for a new arms race?
It appears that the decision makers in the Trump administration believe that they can engage in an arms race that will have the impact that it had in the 1980s in undermining the Russian economy. And it's a very dangerous move that's being made. We reject this. Those of us who are part of the anti-war and pro-peace community, we believe this is a very ominous move, and we are hoping that more of the U.S. population becomes aware of this, and we put pressure on this administration and pressure on Congress to demand that the U.S. re-engage with Russia, re-engage with the international community to put back in place safeguards to avoid a catastrophic potential nuclear war between Russia and the U.S. Very, very dangerous. Very, very dangerous situation.
And it's not just relations with Russia that are strained. Even relationships with some of the U.S.'s closest allies are hurting at the moment. It's recently become trendy in corporate media to, for example, criticize the relationship between Trump specifically and the Saudi royal family since the details of the murder of writer Jamal Khashoggi emerged. Is that relationship unique to Trump? But more importantly, well, I'm answering my question already, how has the historic relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia served U.S. imperial interests? And do you think it's subject to change anytime soon?
Unfortunately, unless there's significant pressure coming from the public, that relationship won't change anytime soon because there are powerful economic interests in the U.S. That want to maintain that relationship. As long as the Saudi regime continues to purchase billions of dollars of military hardware from the military-industrial complex, there would be significant political pressure to maintain that relationship. So, yeah, but I think that it is starting to change in the sense that more and more people are becoming aware of this relationship between the U.S. and the Saudis. More and more people are becoming aware of this obscene war that's being waged by the Saudis in Yemen with the full support of the U.S. state. And now people are raising questions regarding that relationship. So there's going to be significant pressure being put on U.S. decision makers. But the only way we're going to be able to sever that relationship is if there is a significant push coming from the people. We hope that happens pretty quickly.
I want to bring the conversation back home for a moment because in addition to militarization around the world, the U.S. has a legacy of militarization at home, particularly when it comes to how the U.S. government has dealt with the black population in the United States. And today, still, we're seeing racially motivated violence. Just yesterday, a white man shot a black man and a black woman in a Kentucky grocery store after failing to enter a black church. What do you make of this kind of racial violence in the current state?
Well, it's very troubling. There is a very troubling move toward normalizing racial violence. We are concerned that the racial violence we have seen in the form of militarism and war being directed toward people of color in the global South has had a corresponding negative impact in the U.S. in making non-European life relatively cheap. And with this environment, with the open and crude racism coming from the Trump administration and the move toward more intensified violence, we are concerned that this attack the other day is just really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what could happen with violence, racialized violence here in this country. So the vigilante violence is a concern. The concern of the state violence coming from the police is a concern. And the state violence coming from the U.S. military abroad are all interconnected and all represent real concerns that we have in the Black Alliance for Peace, that we are facing a situation now where the lives of non-Europeans are cheap and that we are, in fact, more endangered today than in any other time in the history of this country.
Well, finally, Mr. Baraka, in this society here in the U.S., there's a real stigma around questioning the official narrative about anything. If you bring up the subjects we've just discussed, you risk being labeled fringe, anti-American, an apologist for Russia or China. Of course, the list goes on. When did groupthink, as opposed to critical thought, become the American way?
Well, it is part of the U.S. experience. The group thinking has been part of that experience for quite some time. But that has been countered by critical thinking and by a pretty aggressive and strong progressive movement here in this country. But in the recent few months, the recent couple of years, with the move toward undermining the ability to have access to critical information, critical analysis that we see taking place with the censorship of the internet, we are seeing now that one narrative is beginning to be pushed. That narrative is a narrative of the state and the corporate sector to the detriment of the rest of us who are thinking critically and see the world in different ways. So it's a very dangerous situation that is leading us to a situation where violence and aggression and war becomes normalized and, in fact, accepted by people in the United States of America.
Well, critical thought can only happen, like you say, if people have access to information and analysis just like yours. So we're going to try to fight back here by continuing to provide some other perspectives to the mainstream that we hear constantly rattling the drums of war. But we appreciate you so much coming on today, Mr. Ajamu Baraka, former vice presidential candidate for the Green Party, renowned human rights defender. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.